8 men, 32 magazines each. 250 Taliban fighters advancing through 3 breach points at dawn. By hour 4, the SAS patrol was down to counting individual rounds on their fingers. By hour 6, the compound's walls had absorbed so many RPG strikes that defenders navigated by the daylight, bleeding through new holes. Not one of the 8 died. "Send the Brits. They're insane." That phrase echoed across American tactical networks in Helmand Province, September 2006, when a district center called Musa Qala became mathematically indefensible. 8 SAS operators held that position for 6 hours against 250 Taliban fighters. When the after-action reports reached Pentagon analysts, 3 separate reviewers flagged the casualty figures as transcription errors. They weren't errors. This is not a story about superior firepower or technological dominance. This is a story about what happens when you strip modern warfare down to its most primitive mathematics: bullets, bodies, and the willingness to make each round count. Dawn in Musa Qala smelled like cordite and goat dung. The compound walls caught the first RPG strike at 0531 hours, and within 90 seconds the air became something solid. A suspension of pulverized mud brick, propellant residue, and the particular copper tang that men who have been shot at recognize as aerosolized blood. Radiostatic competed with the crack of incoming 7.62 rounds. Somewhere beyond the eastern wall, a PKM machine gun found its rhythm, the cyclic rate distinctive enough that the SAS patrol leader identified the weapon before the first tracer arced overhead. 8 men occupied defensive positions across a compound roughly the size of a tennis court. They had arrived 48 hours earlier on a reconnaissance tasking, lightly equipped for mobility rather than sustained defense. The ammunition they carried was calculated for a fighting withdrawal, not a siege. The siege found them anyway. 250 Taliban fighters had moved into assault positions overnight, their approach masked by the terrain features that made Musa Qala a tactical nightmare. The district center sat in a valley bowl, surrounded by elevation on 3 sides, every compound and rooftop a potential firing position. The SAS patrol had mapped 17 distinct threat vectors during their initial reconnaissance. By dawn, all 17 were active simultaneously. Military historians who later studied the engagement struggled with the numerical disparity. 31-to-1 odds exceeded the statistical threshold for defensive viability in every doctrinal manual from Sandhurst to West Point. The SAS operators had not read those manuals on the morning of the attack, or rather, they had read them, understood them, and filed the information under interesting but irrelevant. The patrol leader's first radio transmission to headquarters contained 3 data points: grid coordinates, enemy strength estimate, and ammunition status. His voice, according to signals intelligence personnel who monitored the frequency, carried no particular urgency. What does urgency accomplish when mathematics has already declared you dead? The 8 men had 6 hours to answer that question through the only medium that mattered: sustained, accurate fire. Pentagon briefing maps rendered Musa Qala as a tidy administrative unit, a district center represented by standardized military symbology, suggesting organized governance and defensible infrastructure. The satellite imagery showed rectangular compounds, discernible roads, the orderly geometry that Western planners project onto unfamiliar terrain. The reality was fundamentally different. September 2006, Musa Qala existed as a collection of crumbling mud brick structures connected by alleyways too narrow for vehicles and too winding for reliable fields of fire. The district center compound, the position the SAS patrol occupied, had been built decades earlier for administrative purposes, not defense. Its walls varied between 18 inches and 3 feet thick, depending on which local contractor had completed which section. The western wall had partially collapsed during a previous engagement, creating a breach that sandbags could slow but not seal. Elevation dominated the tactical calculus. The compound sat at the valley floor while potential firing positions climbed the surrounding slopes to heights of 400 meters. Any defender looking outward looked upward. Any attacker looking inward looked down. Water came from a well inside the compound perimeter, but accessing it required crossing 12 meters of open ground visible from the northern ridgeline. Resupply helicopters could not land within the compound and faced withering fire from multiple elevated positions during approach to nearby landing zones. The isolation was not merely geographic, but logistical. Every bullet, every bandage, every bottle of water represented a calculation against diminishing reserves. The Taliban understood this terrain intimately. Many of the fighters massing in the surrounding compounds had been born within walking distance of their assault positions, had played in these alleyways as children, knew which walls would stop a bullet and which would fragment into secondary projectiles. They understood that the British compound contained murder holes on the eastern approach, narrow apertures where defenders could fire outward, but that the western breach negated much of that advantage. Musa Qala was not a battle chosen by the SAS patrol. It was a battle imposed by geography, and geography in Helmand province had always favored those who knew it longest. The Special Air Service does not select soldiers. It filters for a specific psychological architecture that conventional military training cannot manufacture, a capacity to function with precision while every biological system screams for withdrawal. The 8 men in Musa Qala represented approximately 40 cumulative months of SAS selection and continuation training, a process that begins with 200 candidates and typically produces fewer than 15 operators per cycle. The mathematics of that filtration rate, roughly 7%, understates the actual selectivity, because candidates who attempt SAS selection have already distinguished themselves within their parent regiments. These are not average soldiers failing an elite course. These are exceptional soldiers discovering that exceptional is insufficient. British selection doctrine emphasizes what the regiment calls comfortable in chaos, the ability to process tactical information, make decisions, and execute precise actions while exhausted, hungry, cold, and under fire. The philosophy diverges sharply from American special operations culture, which emphasizes technological integration and overwhelming firepower. The SAS tradition, forged in North African deserts and Malayan jungles, assumes that technology will fail, support will not arrive, and the operator will be alone with his skills and his ammunition. The Musa Qala patrol composition reflected standard SAS reconnaissance configuration: a patrol commander with signals capability, a demolition specialist, 2 medically trained operators, and 4 assaulters capable of overlapping any specialty. On each man carried identical base loadouts: personal weapon, sidearm, fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades, with specialist equipment distributed according to mission requirements. Critically, each man had completed at least 1 previous combat deployment in either Iraq or Afghanistan. They had seen what happened when modern warfare stripped away the helicopters, the artillery, and the quick reaction forces. They understood viscerally what conventional troops learned only through catastrophe: that every engagement eventually becomes 8 men and their magazines, and nothing else matters. Command sent these particular men to Musa Qala because the reconnaissance tasking required operators who could disappear, observe, and extract without incident. That these same men possessed the capacity for sustained defensive combat was not coincidental. It was institutional inheritance. Section 4. The Taliban's Coordinated Dawn Assault. Word count 356, 0530 hours. First light bled across the eastern ridgeline, and the Taliban assault began with a sophistication that would later force NATO intelligence analysts to revise their assumptions about insurgent command structures. The attack unfolded across 3 simultaneous axes, each directed by separate commanders communicating through runners rather than radio, a discipline that denied British signals intelligence any early warning. The northern element, approximately 80 fighters, initiated with sustained PKM fire from elevated positions, forcing defenders to cover while the eastern and western assault groups advanced through connecting alleyways. The eastern group, 60 fighters strong, pushed toward the compound's main entrance, absorbing casualties but maintaining momentum. The western group exploited the collapsed wall section, probing for the breach point that their reconnaissance had identified days earlier. This was not the uncoordinated mob attack that Western doctrine assumed insurgents would conduct. This was fire and maneuver warfare executed with discipline that suggested either formal military training or extensive combat experience. Likely both, given the presence of foreign fighters from Chechnya and Pakistan within Taliban ranks. The SAS patrol leader recognized the tactical sophistication within the first 3 minutes. The synchronized initiation across multiple axes indicated rehearsal. The use of suppressive fire to enable movement indicated doctrinal training. The targeting of the western breach indicated prior intelligence collection on defensive vulnerabilities. The British defenders faced an enemy that had studied them. Initial contact generated an immediate ammunition expenditure problem. Defensive fire across 3 axes, sustained at rates necessary to suppress advancing infantry, burned through magazines at roughly twice the pace that training scenarios assumed. The patrol's demolitions specialist expended 4 magazines in the first 20 minutes, holding the western breach, a rate that extrapolated to total ammunition exhaustion within 2 hours. The Taliban commanders had calculated precisely this mathematics. Their assault plan assumed that superior numbers would force defensive fire rates unsustainable across a 6-hour engagement, that the British would eventually face the choice between controlled retreat and death by empty magazine. What they had not calculated was who they were fighting. Section 5. Ammunition Mathematics of Impossible Defense. Word count 358. Each SAS operator carried a standard combat load, 8 30-round magazines for his primary weapon, plus 2 15-round magazines for his sidearm. The mathematics translates to 240 rifle rounds and 30 pistol rounds per man, or 1,920 rifle rounds and 240 pistol rounds for the entire 8-man patrol, against 250 attackers across a 6-hour engagement. Those numbers constitute a death sentence. Our conventional defensive doctrine assumes a sustained fire rate of approximately 6 rounds per minute during active contact, enough to suppress advancing infantry without exhausting ammunition reserves before reinforcement or extraction. At that rate, each defender could sustain fire for 40 minutes before reaching magazine exhaustion. 8 defenders, rotating through fire positions to allow magazine changes and weapon cooling, might extend that timeline to 90 minutes of continuous engagement. The Taliban assault was planned to last until dark. 9 hours. The SAS patrol commander understood this calculus before the first RPG detonated against the eastern wall, and his response reflected the regiment's institutional rejection of technological solutions to human problems. He implemented what special operations trainers call precision economy, a discipline of fire that prioritizes single-aimed shots over suppressive bursts, that demands each trigger pull achieve specific tactical effect rather than psychological comfort. The shift required every operator to abandon the instinct that automatic weapons exist to fill space with metal. Instead, each shot became a discrete decision. Is this target presenting a genuine threat that will be neutralized by this specific round? The mental load was enormous, calculating trajectory, leading movement, assessing target priority, all while receiving fire from multiple directions and processing the continuous input of a deteriorating tactical situation. By hour 2, the patrol had expended approximately 400 rounds and confirmed at least 30 Taliban casualties. The exchange ratio, 13 rounds per confirmed kill, represented shooting that Olympic marksmen would struggle to replicate under range conditions, achieved instead under sustained combat stress by men who had not slept in 40 hours. The ammunition mathematics still predicted defeat. But the SAS patrol had introduced a variable the Taliban's calculations had overlooked. They were not shooting to survive. They were shooting to win. Section 6. When American satellites went dark. 348 words. August 2006. Helmand Province. The constellation of GPS satellites orbiting 20,000 kilometers overhead had been designed to guide precision munitions through sandstorms, through darkness, through the fog of war itself. At $17 billion of orbital infrastructure promising centimeter-accurate positioning to any soldier with a receiver. The reality on that compound wall was fundamentally different. Electromagnetic interference, whether from atmospheric conditions, terrain masking, or deliberate jamming, began degrading GPS signals within the first 90 minutes of contact. Radio communications followed. The digital umbilical connecting 8 men to the entire apparatus of Western military supremacy flickered, stuttered, and died. An American Special Forces sergeant embedded with a partnered unit 3 kilometers east would later describe the moment his own screens went blank. We had million-dollar systems telling us nothing. Meanwhile, the Brits were calling accurate fire with a paper map and a wristwatch. Made me wonder what the hell we'd been training for. The SAS operators didn't pause to troubleshoot equipment. They transitioned instantly, instinctively, to methods their instructors' instructors had employed in Malaya, in Oman, in the Falklands. Compass bearings, dead reckoning, range estimation by eye, the way hunters had judged distance for 10,000 years before electrons carried the calculation. One operator produced a laminated card from his chest rig. Printed on it, manual calculation tables for mortar trajectory, windage corrections, elevation adjustments, the same mathematics that artillery officers had scrawled in muddy notebooks at the Somme, reduced to a waterproof reference smaller than a playing card. The Taliban possessed no satellites, no GPS, no precision-guided anything. They navigated by landmark and attacked by instinct, and for 6 hours they faced opponents who had voluntarily descended to their technological level while retaining every other advantage of training, discipline, and professional violence. Somewhere above Afghanistan, those $17 billion of orbital hardware continued their silent circuits, broadcasting signals to receivers that could no longer hear them. The men below had stopped listening anyway. His name remains classified. His rank does not, corporal, 27 years old. Born in Sheffield, son of a steelworker, graduate of the same SAS selection course that breaks 90% of candidates before day 10. When the mortar team's electronic fire control system failed, this corporal became the system. The mathematics of indirect fire are unforgiving. Projectile weight, propellant charge, tube elevation, ambient temperature, wind speed at multiple altitudes, the rotation of the Earth itself, all variables that modern militaries surrender to microprocessors because human error in any single calculation means rounds landing on friendly positions or empty ground while enemies advance. The corporal computed these figures manually. Pencil on paper, then paper discarded for speed, the numbers running through his mind like water through familiar channels. He had practiced this, not because anyone expected satellite failure, but because SAS selection rewards men who prepare for the catastrophe no one predicts. His first correction landed a mortar round within 8 meters of a Taliban machine gun nest. The second adjustment erased it entirely. For the next 4 hours, he calculated trajectories while bullets fragmented the mud brick inches from his head. Each fire mission required fresh mathematics, new ranges as enemy positions shifted, new windage as the afternoon thermals built and faded. He never stopped. His notebook filled with figures that looked like engineering homework, each page representing another cluster of enemy fighters converted from threat to casualty. An American Joint Terminal Attack controller, who reviewed the after-action reports later, wrote that the corporal's manual calculations achieved accuracy rates comparable to computerized systems, costing $300,000 per unit. The comparison missed the point entirely. Machines achieve accuracy through processing power, through the brute force of calculation speeds no human can match. This corporal achieved accuracy through understanding, through years of study that transformed abstract ballistics into intuition, mathematics into muscle memory. When they teach this engagement at Hereford now, instructors pose a question that has no comfortable answer. What happens when your enemy cannot be defeated by any system you can unplug? The close air support request went out 17 minutes into the engagement. Standard procedure, coordinates transmitted, threat assessment provided, aircraft diverted from holding patterns to prosecute targets that infantry cannot neutralize alone. The response came back with the indifferent cruelty of weather systems that recognize no human urgency. Cloud ceiling below minimums, visibility insufficient for visual weapons release. No precision-guided munitions authorized without positive target identification. Aircraft holding at altitude, awaiting conditions that would not materialize for 6 hours. 6 hours. The number deserves repetition because it represents a promise broken, the fundamental contract of modern combined arms warfare, voided by atmospheric conditions that no technology can negotiate with. Ground forces expose themselves to enemy contact because air power provides the decisive overmatch. Remove that overmatch, and 8 men face 250 with rifles, grenades, and the ammunition they carried on their backs. American doctrine, British doctrine, NATO doctrine, all assume air superiority so complete that the question becomes not whether aircraft will arrive, but how quickly. In Helmand that afternoon, the question became whether aircraft would arrive at all, and the answer was silence broken only by radio static and the continuous percussion of incoming fire. The SAS patrol leader made a decision that would define the engagement. Rather than consolidate into defensive positions and await rescue, he ordered his men to remain distributed across the compound's perimeter walls, maintaining the illusion of a larger force through volume of fire and constant movement. It was a gamble built on understanding his enemy. Taliban commanders counted muzzle flashes. They estimated defender strength by the geometry of return fire. 8 men, moving continuously, engaging from multiple positions, created the signature of a reinforced platoon, enough uncertainty to prevent the massed assault that would have overrun fixed positions within minutes. The clouds did not break. The aircraft did not descend. For 6 hours, the promised umbrella of American and British air power remained a theoretical construct, while actual men with iron sights held actual walls against enemies who could taste victory in the thinning defensive fire. Then the eastern wall fell silent. The breach came at hour 4, when ammunition discipline finally collided with mathematical reality. The operator covering the eastern sector had expended his rifle magazines, maintaining suppressive fire across a 90-degree arc. His secondary weapon, a pistol with 3 remaining rounds, could not hold the frontage that 200 bullets had barely contained. Taliban fighters recognized the gap instantly. 3 men cleared the wall within seconds of each other, dropping into the compound's interior courtyard with the momentum of attackers who understood that hesitation meant death. What followed lasted 11 seconds. The first insurgent died before his feet touched ground, killed by a blade that opened his throat while he was still processing the transition from climbing to fighting. The SAS operator had waited in shadow, allowing the breach rather than announcing his position with ineffective pistol fire, converting disadvantage into ambush through the brutal patience that separates elite soldiers from merely competent ones. The second attacker managed 1 shot, wild high, striking nothing, before being driven into the compound wall with force sufficient to crack mud brick. The struggle was brief and absolute. The third man witnessed both deaths in the span of a heartbeat, and he turned to flee, scrambling back towards the wall he had just crossed, and in that turn revealed everything about the psychological architecture of the engagement. Taliban fighters had charged this compound for 4 hours, believing numbers would eventually overwhelm skill. Watching two comrades die in hand-to-hand combat against a single defender, silently, efficiently, with the mechanical certainty of industrial process, shattered that belief entirely. He did not reach the wall. Outside, other fighters who had staged for the breach heard nothing they expected. No British screams, no extended gunfire indicating room-to-room clearing. Only silence, then the reappearance of suppressive fire from the eastern sector as the operator retrieved weapons from the men who no longer needed them. The counterattack that followed would become required study at military academies on 3 continents, but before examining what the SAS did next, we must understand what their enemy had just learned to fear. Taliban prisoners captured in subsequent Helmand operations spoke of that day with a particular reverence that interrogators learned to recognize. They did not emphasize the mortar fire, though it had killed dozens. They did not dwell on the marksmanship, though every SAS round seemed to find flesh. What haunted their testimony, what surfaced again and again in debriefings conducted months and years later, was the silence of the close-quarters killing. One captured commander, interviewed at Bagram in 2007, described it through an interpreter with evident discomfort. "We shoot, they shoot. This is war. We understand shooting. But these British, when the bullets stopped, they became something else. They wanted to be close. They wanted to use hands." He paused, searching for language adequate to his meaning. "No soldier wants this. Only hunters." The psychological dimension of edged weapon combat operates on neural architecture far older than gunpowder. Projectile weapons create cognitive distance between killer and killed. Blade work eliminates that distance entirely, forcing the attacker to feel resistance, to experience death as a physical transaction rather than a ballistic abstraction. SAS close-quarters training exploits this asymmetry deliberately. Operators spend hundreds of hours learning techniques designed not merely to kill, but to kill in ways that witnesses cannot process without trauma. As the goal is not sadism but efficiency. An enemy who breaks psychologically stops fighting before ammunition expenditure makes the question academic. After the Eastern Wall breach, Taliban assault coordination collapsed. Fighters who had advanced confidently for 4 hours began hesitating at walls they had previously climbed without pause. Squad leaders reported through captured radio traffic that their men were refusing to enter the shadow of the building. The shadow of the building. The phrase recurred across multiple intercepts, always with the same implication: that something waited in darkness that bullets could not address, that the normal calculus of combat, cover, suppression, maneuver, did not apply against men who preferred killing range measured in inches. What those fighters could not know was that the operators they feared were themselves approaching the limits of human endurance. 14,000 feet above Musa Kala, circling in an orbit that kept him perpetually above the chaos, Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb monitored 6 radio frequencies simultaneously. Webb was a Joint Terminal Attack Controller attached to Combined Joint Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan, a man whose entire profession consisted of translating ground chaos into precision airstrikes. He had directed ordnance onto targets in Fallujah, Ramadi, and a dozen villages whose names never appeared in newspapers. By September 2006, he had witnessed enough combat to fill several lifetimes with nightmares. What he heard that night made him request a copy of his own recordings. "I needed proof," Webb later told debriefers, "because nobody was going to believe what I watched those 8 men do." The recordings captured Webb's voice shifting from professional calm to something approaching awe across 6 hours of transmissions. Early exchanges maintained standard protocol: target coordinates, ordnance requests, battle damage assessments delivered in the clipped cadence of military radio procedure. But as the battle progressed, Webb's transmissions began deviating from script. "Recommend immediate extraction. Ground element is danger close to being overrun," he called at hour 3. The British response came back steady. "Negative. We're staying. Keep the air coming. Webb's subsequent transmission to the operations center has been quoted in JTAC training materials ever since. Be advised, our ground element is conducting deliberate defense against battalion-strength enemy force with 8 personnel. They are requesting more ammunition, not extraction. Confirm ground element is SAS. Operations confirmed. That explains it. Webb responded. Nothing more. His after-action report contained language unusual for official military documentation. He described the defense as the most tactically audacious small unit action I have ever personally witnessed, and recommended that recordings be preserved for training purposes, arguing that future JTACs needed to understand what human beings are actually capable of when properly selected and trained. The recordings remain classified, but Webb's written testimony does not, and sometimes validation requires an outside observer, someone with no stake in British pride, to confirm that what happened defied professional expectation. The patrol sergeant took his first wound at hour 2. A rifle round struck his left forearm, shattering the radius and exiting through soft tissue that would require 18 months of reconstruction. He applied his own tourniquet, transitioned his rifle to a one-handed firing position, and continued directing fire for 4 more hours. He was not the exception. He was the standard. By hour 4, 7 of the 8 SAS operators had sustained wounds requiring medical attention. 2 had taken shrapnel to the legs. 1 had lost partial hearing in both ears from a near-miss RPG detonation. Another was fighting through what would later be diagnosed as a severe concussion from the same blast. The patrol medic worked through his own shoulder wound while treating others, his hands slick with blood that wasn't entirely his. Not one requested extraction. This was not bravado. It wasn't the heat of battle overriding judgment. It was something far more calculated, a collective institutional understanding that extraction under fire would likely cost the helicopter crew their lives and that 8 wounded men could still kill more efficiently than the Taliban could advance. The mathematics were coldly rational, accepting personal damage to prevent catastrophic loss. What observers often miss about SAS selection is that the physical brutality serves psychological purpose. Candidates who complete the hills, the jungle phase, or the interrogation resistance training emerge with a recalibrated relationship to their own bodies. Pain becomes data, not emergency. Injury becomes a tactical factor to be managed, not a condition that ends participation. The wounded men of Musa Qala fought through their damage because selection had already proven they could function while their bodies screamed for them to stop. They had done it before, in the Brecon beacons, in the jungle, in circumstances designed specifically to reveal whether a man would quit when his body begged him to. The Taliban faced operators who had already met their physical limits and walked past them years earlier. Medical reports from the subsequent evacuation documented injuries that should have rendered men combat ineffective. The reports failed to account for what regiment selection actually produces. Men who had divorced their will from their wounds long before Afghanistan. Intercepted communications in the 48 hours following Musa Qala revealed confusion bordering on theological crisis. Taliban field commanders reported to their superiors that they had attacked a force of approximately 50 British soldiers supported by armored vehicles. When surveillance confirmed only 8 men and no vehicles had been present, the commanders insisted the intelligence was wrong. They had seen the volume of fire. They had counted the muzzle flashes. They had watched their fighters fall in numbers that no 8-man element could possibly produce. The leadership responded with accusations of cowardice and exaggeration. What followed was an intelligence windfall. Mid-level Taliban commanders began arguing with senior leadership about the nature of British special forces, producing communications that revealed both their tactical analysis and their profound misunderstanding of what they had encountered. "These are not normal soldiers," one commander transmitted. "They do not behave as soldiers behave. They did not retreat when they should have retreated. They did not conserve ammunition when they should have conserved. They fought as if dying meant nothing. Another intercept captured a commander attempting to explain the air support coordination. Every time we moved, fire came from the sky. They have invisible eyes that see in darkness. The invisible eyes were 8 men with radios and training, calling adjustments with the precision of surgeons. What the Taliban could not process was the gap between their assumptions and reality. They had built their tactical doctrine around the premise that small units, when isolated and outnumbered, would prioritize survival over mission. That premise held true for most military forces throughout history. It failed catastrophically against an organization that selects specifically for men who reject that premise. The intercepts eventually reached British intelligence analysts who noted a recurring theme. Taliban commanders kept returning to the word insane in various translations, struggling to categorize behavior that their experience had never prepared them to encounter. They were attempting to explain defeat through the lens of rationality, never understanding that their opponents had been selected precisely for their willingness to operate beyond rational limits. Dawn broke over Musa Qala at 0547 local time, painting the compound walls in colors that seemed inappropriate for a place soaked in blood. The Taliban had withdrawn 90 minutes earlier, dragging their casualties into the pre-dawn darkness after a final assault that cost them another 12 fighters. The compound's defenders had expended nearly everything. Final ammunition counts showed an average of 2 magazines per man remaining, with the machine gun reduced to a single belt that the gunner had been rationing round by round. Extraction had been attempted twice during the night, and aborted both times due to ground fire intensity. Chinook call sign Venom 31 had taken hits on both approaches, and its crew reporting that the landing zone was simply too hot. The pilots had risked their aircraft and their lives. Asking them to try again seemed unconscionable. But at 0612, with Taliban forces regrouping in the distant tree lines, Venom 31's pilot made a decision that would earn him a Distinguished Flying Cross. Captain James Harrington brought his Chinook in low and fast, using terrain masking that kept his aircraft hidden until the final 30 seconds of approach. His co-pilot later described the landing as controlled crashing with style. The 8 SAS operators loaded in under 90 seconds, carrying 1 man who could no longer walk and supporting 3 others who probably shouldn't have been. The Chinook lifted through sporadic fire, its door gunners suppressing muzzle flashes that flickered from compounds the patrol hadn't even known were occupied. At 0619, Venom 31 cleared the engagement area and climbed toward Kandahar. The crew chief, walking back to check on his passengers, found 8 bloodied men conducting weapons maintenance, not sleeping, not celebrating, cleaning their rifles and reloading magazines from ammunition the helicopter carried for exactly such emergencies. They looked like they were preparing for another fight, he reported, like the last 6 hours hadn't happened. Harrington's testimony captured something the official reports couldn't. I've extracted a lot of units from bad situations. I've never extracted men who looked disappointed that it was over. The defense of Musa Qala appears in curricula at Sandhurst, West Point, and the Australian Defence Force Academy, taught not as a historical curiosity, but as a living problem set. Instructors pose the same question across 3 continents. How did 8 men defeat 250? The obvious answers: superior training, air support, defensive positioning. Explain part of it. They don't explain the part that matters. They don't explain why the Taliban, who had successfully overwhelmed better-positioned defenders with superior numbers before, failed so completely against a force they should have annihilated by mathematics alone. The answer lies in variables that modern military doctrine struggles to quantify. Selection matters. The SAS selection process doesn't identify the strongest candidates or the most aggressive. It identifies men whose psychological architecture allows them to function when every reasonable metric suggests they should collapse. It produces soldiers who treat impossible odds as interesting problems rather than existential threats. Institutional culture matters. The men at Musa Qala fought as their predecessors had fought in Oman, in the Falklands, in Iraq, with an inherited expectation that regiment soldiers do not surrender terrain, regardless of cost. They carried ghosts alongside their ammunition. Human judgment matters. Every critical decision that night, the ammunition discipline, the coordinated air support, the refusal to evacuate wounded, required real-time analysis that no algorithm could replicate. Satellite coverage meant nothing. Drone footage meant nothing. What mattered was 8 men reading a battlefield through smoke and darkness and making correct choices faster than their enemy. The paradox that generals study is this. In an era when defense ministries spend billions developing autonomous systems, precision munitions, and artificial intelligence, 8 men with analog skills proved more lethal than technology had promised to make them. The Taliban brought overwhelming numbers, religious fervor, and home field advantage to Musa Qala. The SAS brought something technology cannot replicate and doctrine cannot easily teach, the institutional character that transforms individual soldiers into something greater than their sum. In that compound, for 6 hours, human selection defeated human trafficking in bodies. The compass had defeated the cosmos once again. What happened at Musa Qala was never officially classified, but it was never officially publicized either. The regiment prefers its victories quiet, its lessons learned internally, its legends passed between generations of operators rather than broadcast to the public. If this account taught you something about what elite selection actually produces, consider subscribing. The next video examines another impossible defense, one that occurred 3 decades earlier, in a place called Mirbat, where the SAS first learned that 9 men could hold against hundreds. That story begins with a single gunner named Laba Laba,